Hey everyone, I finally got my hands on a laptop with Intel's brand new Panther Lake CPU, including the fastest Panther Lake Intel Arc B390 iGPU with all 12xe3 cores. For that, we're going to use this ASUS ZenBook Duo, which comes with an Intel Core Ultra X9 388H, Intel's new high-end CPU with 4P, 8E and 4LP cores for a total of 16 cores. Also, this laptop comes with 32 GB of DDR5 with the maximum possible speed of 9600 megatransfers per second. So, despite this being a quite exotic laptop, we should see the best possible outcome. For today's test, I was setting the TDP to around 45 watt, which is the laptop's maximum wattage for the PL1, while the results would almost be identical at only 35 watt, and there will be some more detailed comparison videos online soon, so make sure you won't miss them. All games have been captured at 1080p via an external capture card to minimize performance loss due to recording, and I was using at least medium settings if the games were able to run those in a satisfying manner from my point of view. I've also used the most recent available Intel drivers and installed all Windows and ASUS updates. And before we start, I'd really appreciate a like or even a subscription, as these kind of videos take so much time to make. Thank you. The games will be presented in alphabetical order, also feel free to use the timeline to navigate directly to your favorite games.
Since we're in alphabetical order, the new Anno 117 is going to be the first game of today, for which I was testing 1080p with the medium preset and XeSS on ultra quality, which is comparable to FSR on quality resolution-wise. I saw an average FPS of around 52, and we can kinda ignore the 1% lows here. First, because they're not that important in such a game, and there are microstutters when we switch between continents, so that would destroy the measured 1% lows here. But since the newest Anno iteration is very GPU based and the CPU plays a way less important role, we're always GPU bound and the gameplay is very stable. Perfectly playable and enjoyable on the Intel B390 in the Core Ultra X9 388H. Next. For Apex Legends, I was actually able to use more than the lowest settings and still get a stable 144 FPS on average, which is the game's FPS cap if you don't tinker around with ini files to get around that. And to be honest, the game just looks much better that way, and it's still super playable as you can see here, with flat frame times, high FPS and decent enough looks at 1080p. Also, let's have a quick look at the settings that I used if you're interested. I mean, if you'd want to play that at 1440p instead, you most likely could, and there's even some headroom left with lower settings, etc. I really like playing Arc Raiders, to be honest, and on the Intel Core Ultra X9 388H and its Intel Arc B390, that is absolutely possible in a good way. I was using 1080p with the medium preset and XeSS on ultra quality, which gave me a very playable 98 FPS on average and 1% lows of around 60 FPS caused by rare microstutters. This game, despite using the Unreal Engine, is very well optimized and puts other developers to shame if you ask me, because it looks great and plays well, even on iGPUs, and actually even on weaker and older iGPUs as well. But not as good as on the B390 here. If you're okay with 60 FPS only, you could even further raise the resolution or just use native rendering, etc. However, overall, well done, and well, back to Speranza. For Assassin's Creed Shadows, on the other hand, I had to use the ultra low preset in combination with FSR on balanced to achieve just about 60 FPS on average. The game runs very stable, that's basically the case on all systems I've ever tested with it, but it's probably one of the most GPU demanding games right now, and I always think that the performance hunger doesn't lead to graphics that justify that, but that's just my opinion. However, you can play it on this CPU/iGPU with 60 FPS at 1080p. If you're a bit more hardcore and okay with 30 FPS for a single player game, you could surely use less aggressive upscaling or slightly higher settings instead. Avowed didn't run as stable, and it is also very demanding on current hardware. I was using 1080p with FSR on quality and a mix of low and high settings, as I was tinkering around a bit to get somewhat playable FPS with graphics that don't look completely bad. But I don't know, this game always seems a bit blurry to me, especially since I'm often testing it with lower end hardware. Probably haven't actually seen it with really good graphics yet. An average of 51 FPS is okay for a single player title, and the 1% lows have been around 30 FPS, but as you can see in the frame time graph, there are some problematic scenes here and there for this one. I mean, it is doable, but it's far from optimal. For Baldurs Gate 3 I was using 1080p with the medium preset and actually no upscaling, so we are getting real native 1080p here. The average FPS depends a lot on the current region in this game, and we are getting around 60 to 80 FPS on the outside in Act 1 and 80 to 100 FPS inside the bigger Goblin Cave, while even the city in Act 3 seems to work mostly fine once all shaders etc. are loaded. Also, I was using the Vulkan API as that one ran much more stable and fluid compared to DirectX. However, one of the best games of the last few years, huge campaign, over 120 hours of fun, and absolutely playable on Intel's new iGPU Hero here. I have to say I was really surprised at how stable and well Battlefield 6 was running from the first second, as it usually took minutes to stabilize for older Battlefield titles in the past. Of course, I was using the low preset at 1080p to get high FPS in combination with XeSS on ultra quality, which all still looks pretty okay if you ask me, with 75 to around 88 FPS on average depending on the map, and surprisingly good and stable 1% lows. Again, pretty surprising for a Battlefield game. They probably finally did something right here. But we also have to factor in that the X9 388H is a beast of a CPU with an insanely good single-core performance, which in the end is also very important for gaming. The direct Battlefield competitor in form of Black Ops 7 Warzone ran very similar at 1080p with the minimal graphics preset and XeSS ultra quality. I saw around 90 FPS on average, which is of course playable, but the 1% lows have been less good with around 53. Caused by some occasional micro-stuttering. However, overall, that is of course playable okay, while to get 120 FPS or more, you would have to use much more aggressive upscaling, which would lead to a noticeably blurry or muddy image. A VRAM usage over 8GB here suggests that even RTX 4070, 5060, 5070 and so on could run into issues here. For Clair Obscur Expedition 33 I was actually able to use the medium preset again and still get playable average FPS of 53 FPS and 1% lows of 36 FPS. While FrameGen is an option you could pull, I have to be honest, I am not sure if that's an issue with the real-time parrying and dodging system due to the potentially higher input lag. However, despite that, the game seems to be running just fine, enjoyable and playable since it's mostly round-based, and for exploring the performance seems to be good enough, especially on smaller laptop screens or maybe one day on even smaller gaming handheld screens. I also wanted to test Crimson Desert, which I actually bought for this video. And at the release day, it became clear that the game won't run on Intel GPUs like at all. However, while editing this video, the developers actually enabled Intel GPUs. While according to Intel, there hasn't been any optimization at all yet. So really take these results with a grain of salt, since we should expect heavy optimizations over the next weeks. At least that's what we can hope for. While I was able to play the game for 30 minutes without crashing, it's not yet possible to turn on FSR for upscaling, at least for the laptop that I used, as that would make the game crash. Also, I'm not sure about the resolution working as intended. At 1080p native and the minimum settings preset, I was getting playable FPS of 53 on average and 1% lows of 33. Using low settings reduced the FPS to around 40 and medium settings to around 30. However, with the minimum preset, it actually feels somewhat fluid and doable, while it's not looking great apart from the great view distance and the vistas. Considering that the game is in general optimized pretty okay, it's clearly not the case for Intel GPUs yet. Since the CPU part in this chip is, as said before, also super strong, especially for the single core part, CS2 ran exceptionally well for an iGPU at 1080p with low settings and FSR turned off. So we're at 1080p native. 201 FPS on average, and as always, rather low 1% lows, which you won't notice in CS2. as it's an engine issue with displaying 1% lows. It is perfectly playable even on a faster 144 to 165 Hz display, and we even won't need to use any blurry FSR implementation for good frame rates here. The times when Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most demanding games to test are, well, over. But it's still an important benchmark nonetheless, and the B390 is really acing it at 1080p. With medium settings and XeSS and ultra quality, that gave me a great average FPS of 78 FPS and 1% lows of 49 FPS, while the game already looks really good at medium settings, and XeSS on ultra quality is doing a good job as well, and I think it's absolutely okay to use that on a laptop or let alone gaming handheld. Pretty good experience overall, didn't really expect that game to run that good, and even driving around was doable very well. Due to popular demand, I was adding Dragon's Dogma 2 to my list of games to benchmark, but I have to be honest, I'm not sure about the graphics here, as they seem pretty blurry for what we're getting. 1080p with the favor performance preset, and I'm not sure if upscaling was enabled, as all the settings have been grayed out and even the config file tricks I found online didn't seem to fix that. So the result was both blurry and graphically meh, while still only getting 48 FPS on average. But to be honest, I still have to get some experience with that one, so you might be able to get better results here with some tricks and tinkering around, or maybe it's a driver issue, I don't know. Diablo 4, however, was perfectly playable even with the high graphics preset in combination with XeSS on ultra quality, once more, which led to a decent average FPS of 81 FPS and mostly stable frame times with 1% lows of 51 FPS. So for gaming handhelds, that would definitely lead to a perfect experience, but even on bigger laptop or even standalone monitors, that would be doable, as you could probably even use 1440p with some upscaling for a sharper image here. Doom: The Dark Ages is surprisingly demanding for a Doom series game in my opinion, at least on this B390. Even at the low settings preset with XeSS on quality, I didn't get 60 FPS on average, but instead only around 54 FPS, though good 1% lows of 43 FPS. And it crashed on me twice. Not sure if that's a driver issue or bad luck. I mean, hopefully it's to be fixed soon. Otherwise, it is playable, even though not as good as I expected, to be honest. PS, the VRAM usage seems to be massive with already 7.5 GB, even using these low settings at 1080p and upscaling. Good thing we have 32 GB in total here. Elden Ring really worked perfectly fine at 1080p with the high preset even. The game has a 60 FPS cap and I was getting the full 60 FPS almost all of the time, with some exceptions here and there. But it's running great overall with decent 1% lows of 45 FPS, and of course with the high preset it looks fine as well. I mean, it's been released 4 years ago, but still good to know it's playable so well using the B390 in the X9 388H. EA's FC26 was no problem at all for the B390 with an average of 83 FPS using the high preset at 1080p native. You could either use ultra settings or even a higher 1440p resolution for this one, I guess. But then again, soccer games usually aren't the most demanding. Would have surprised me if it had been any different. 1% lows are only that low because of stuttering in cutscenes, etc. Other than that, it was very stable and smooth. Forza Horizon 5 worked perfectly fine as well. High 124 FPS on average, with really amazing 1% lows of 102 FPS at 1080p with the high preset and MSAA by 2. Finally working good on Intel iGPUs as well, since AMD usually had a big lead here. One could surely use 1440p as well, or maybe even 4K if you're fine with 60 FPS, which would surely be doable. And actually, I just added that footage while I was writing the script for today's video, and it turns out it's pretty much a straight 60 FPS on average at 4K high. Nice. I tested Fortnite both using the performance mode with the maximum settings at 1080p and also the standard DirectX 12 API at 1080p with medium settings and XeSS. Yeah, you guessed it, on ultra quality. And I used a replay for a fair comparison. For the performance mode, I saw 190 FPS on average and 1% lows of 118. While for the better looking standard DirectX 12 mode, that was 114 FPS on average with 1% lows of 85. And I guess it's completely up to you what you'd prefer here, but it's absolutely playable either way in my opinion. Either with low graphics settings and very high FPS, or with better graphics and slightly lower FPS. For GTA 5 I was actually using the high ray tracing preset at native 1080p, so no upscaling active. And that still got me super high 92 FPS on average. Wow, that was surprising to be honest. I didn't expect any game with ray tracing activated to be actually good looking and playable on this iGPU. Decent 1% lows of 70 FPS by the way, probably even doable at 1440p with around 60 FPS. Which is really cool for an iGPU. Really smooth frame time graph as well. No issues whatsoever. Good for you, Intel. Hogwarts Legacy isn't working nearly as well. Probably an Intel-based driver issue. RAM wouldn't be the issue since we got plenty of it and very fast one with 9600 megatransfers as well. I had to use ASUS on balanced in combination with the medium preset for an average of 51 FPS at 1080p with really bad 1% lows of only 14. But Hogwarts Legacy often behaves that way due to its bad Unreal Engine 5 optimization with lots of transfer stuttering and shader loading issues, etc. Constant micro stuttering, which does get better after a while, but it's still annoying. One could play the game that way, but I wouldn't call it a great experience. Maybe an FPS cap or low settings and an FPS cap would be a good idea here. While Indiana Jones and the Great Circle was in general playable, I had to use the low preset at 1080p with FSR on balanced, which already utilizes more than 8GB of VRAM. I saw around 48 FPS on average with 1% lows of 30, but I had two crashes both in the Vatican map and the Gizeh map after a few minutes of walking around, which could mean it would further be necessary to lower settings or maybe hope for driver updates. As I mean, at the making of this video, the iGPU is brand new and Intel is kinda known for driver issues, especially in the beginning, to be honest. However, I always look forward to test Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 because, and I'm not getting tired to repeat and emphasize that, and no, we're all saying this together, one of the best optimized games ever, period. 1080p and medium settings with FSR on quality, and that way the game definitely looks pretty good on a handheld or a laptop screen, also much sharper than, for example, Avowed or Dragon's Dogma or Assassin's Creed Shadows. Perfectly doable 67 FPS on average and very good 1% lows of 49 FPS. I did have quite a lot of micro stuttering in the first few minutes before I actually recorded the game, to be honest, but that was gone after a while. So let's have a look at the next game. Microsoft Flight Simulator seemed to start and run just to crash on me every time I was trying to actually load into a flight, no matter which settings or which map or plane I was trying. Already the third game that crashed on me using this laptop. PUBG ran surprisingly well, though I have to admit it's now been 9 years since its first release. Crazy. And I was only using the medium preset here. However, at 1080p native that gave me a very nice average of 102 FPS. Not too shabby at all. In fact, very responsive and looking decent enough at the same time. Absolutely playable, and it's also not the fastest shooter around, so I guess you could even play it with some ambitions here. But the 1% lows haven't been perfect, at least in the first round, with around 50 FPS only, which is just 50 FPS of the total average, and you'd usually want at least 66%, as in 2/3 or more. Spiderman 2 is known to use a lot of VRAM, which is in general not an issue for an iGPU laptop with 32GB of RAM, at least yet. The total RAM usage of system and VRAM then was around 28GB, so we actually had a spare of only 4GB left. However, I was only using 1080p with medium settings, and that already utilized more than 8GB for the ReRAM. Again, not the first game of today, and soon this chip could outperform a lot of mid-range and some higher-end Nvidia GPUs in certain scenarios and games. Well, for Spiderman 2, this gave me a decent average of 71 FPS and not optimal 1% lows of 34 FPS. And to be honest, I think the game still had issues with loading some textures as seen in this scene, despite having enough RAM at its side. Well, Intel drivers? Question mark? I was testing Starfield at 1080p with the medium preset, but I had to use XeSS on balanced, which of course starts to show some blurriness due to the upscaling. But again, on a laptop screen or maybe one day handheld screen, that is okay. Also, the game seemed to be playable with around 45 to 60 FPS, which here depends a lot on the current map, whether you're on a planet, a city or a small inside area, etc. But I mean, it does look pretty good from time to time, even with the medium settings only. I would personally definitely play the game that way on this laptop. The remakes of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 and 4 are working perfectly fine on the B390 at 1080p native with TAA anti-aliasing and the high preset enabled. Around 80 to 90 FPS on average and 1% lows of around 59 FPS. A good experience, appropriate graphics, not much to say here other than I expected such an easier game to run well and playable on this iGPU. An exotic but interesting game to test on GPUs and iGPUs is UEBS 2, the ultimate epic battle simulator 2, because in contrast to most other games, this one uses the GPU to render and calculate massive amounts of units. Here in this example, I was testing the game at 1080p with the medium preset and I was having two armies of around 200,000 soldiers each fighting each other. And you can see the CPU is basically doing nothing here, which is kind of funny. I mean, this is not about optics, especially at medium settings only, but good to know the B390 can pull that one off as well. Valorant is a super light game to run, still very popular, and at 1080p native and low settings I saw a very high average of 310 FPS with 1% lows of 194 FPS. So if you're losing in that game, you probably couldn't blame it on your hardware in this case. Absolutely enough for super high refresh rate monitors as well. And now we are taking a look at the last game for today, which is The Witcher 3, released 11 years ago, still looking good, especially if you're using the high preset at 1440p native, as seen in this example, while I was actually using the older DirectX 11 version, since I'm not a big fan of the next generation update, as that really tanks the performance. Around 55 FPS on average with 1% lows of 25 to 40. Quite impressive that it's really playable that way on an iGPU. Of course, at 1080p I was getting higher FPS, but I just wanted to give an older game a chance at 1440p, and in my opinion, it's absolutely playable and enjoyable that way.
So, despite some issues here and there, most likely driver related, Intel finally managed to achieve an impressive performance improvement for a low-powered iGPU, and this could lead to a significant improvement for upcoming gaming handhelds where the current AMD Z2 Extreme chips are way weaker. While AMD still has the fastest iGPU in form of the Strix Halo-based Ryzen AI Max 385 and Max Plus 395, these chips need more wattage to unleash their full power, which of course isn't optimal in gaming handhelds or thin and light laptops. But at the end, as always, it all comes down to the price, and given the current situation on the PC and laptop hardware market, I don't see these chips in affordable laptops or mini PCs, let alone gaming handhelds, at least in the near future. Because in devices for under $1,000, these could be absolutely amazing, but with the current memory situation, I don't know, we'll see. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel for upcoming comparison videos with the Intel Arc B390 iGPU in here. Thank you very much. Also, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and cheers.